You know, my father taught me a great many lessons, but I would say the one that he really tried to make stick is the whole concept of actions having consequences. And OneWeb, sadly, is learning that bitter lesson right now. Their decision to make use of Roscosmos and the Soyuz rocket and to go through Arianespace in order to deploy their constellation in the first place, and of course their decision to not do business with Roscosmos on their terms, that is to say, to remove all UK interests in the company altogether. And this is an action that's going to have consequences for a great many people, not just the British, who have invested hundreds of millions of pounds in this whole enterprise, but also India, who, ironically, is not sanctioning Russia to any great extent, really didn't have any interest in taking any sort of aggressive actions against Russia, and yet now is paying a very steep price because they are major investors in OneWeb, and they have just lost their only launch provider that's really practical for OneWeb at the moment. And for those of you who think that I was getting a little clickbaity with the title and the whole bankruptcy talk and everything as far as that's concerned, I would remind you that OneWeb only recently emerged from bankruptcy, and largely with the help of the British government. And bankruptcy for this company is a very real possibility because, frankly, they need a launch provider, they need a rocket that's going to work in conjunction with how their satellites are packaged, and those rockets are very, very hard to come by. And although it's very, very easy to blame OneWeb for their decision to do business with Arianespace and Russia in the first place, I am not really of that mindset. I don't subscribe to that perspective at all. Instead, I blame Arianespace and Europe in general for not having a robust variety of launch vehicles for their huge number of customers in Europe. And I also blame the United States, many of whose launch providers have also been reliant on Russian engines and Russian components, something I've talked a great deal about. So what is OneWeb going to do, and what really is at stake here? Is OneWeb once again doomed to bankruptcy and perhaps complete collapse? Is Starlink going to take complete control? Could SpaceX, an arch rival of OneWeb, actually provide a ride for these satellites? Or do they have another choice? We're going to find all of that out in just a moment. So the first and most obvious question that anyone would ask is, why not SpaceX? Why doesn't Elon Musk come riding in on a white charger and save the day for OneWeb, as he does for so many other organizations that have been impacted by the sanctions, including the ISS? Well, obviously because Elon Musk is a rival of OneWeb. Now, to be fair, Starlink is not a direct competitor for OneWeb. Elon Musk wants to provide high-speed internet service to every human being on the planet, which requires an enormous constellation of thousands and thousands of satellites. OneWeb's ambitions are far more targeted. They want to go after larger companies or universities, other sorts of academic institutions, and also aircraft. Essentially, OneWeb wants to provide worldwide access to companies and governmental institutions and not to private customers, whereas Elon Musk wants to take care of governments and businesses and residential customers, anybody who wants to click a mouse and get access to the internet. He wants them to go through Starlink. So that is a very important difference. OneWeb is not going to take away all of Elon Musk's business. They're not going to come anywhere close to that, no matter how good they do. So why would Elon not want to provide them with launch access? Well, because commercial customers and governmental customers are the best kind of customers. I worked in the telecom/data transmission industry for 2 decades, and I'm here to tell you, residential customers don't pay their bills on time, whereas businesses always do, and that is extremely important to any company. Commercial accounts are absolutely vital to a company's ongoing success. And by the way, if you're wondering why the hell I'm making use of a OneWeb promotional video that has Cyrillic subtitles, it's because this region of the world has created this current crisis. To be more specific, Putin has created this current crisis. OneWeb's situation was not absolutely sealed. There was, at the beginning, an agreement to launch OneWeb constellations anyway, utilizing Soyuz rockets and Arianespace, but that fell apart very rapidly. Dmitry Rogozin and Putin and their various cronies made the decision that they wanted to punish the United Kingdom in particular if OneWeb would remove the United Kingdom and all of their vested interest from OneWeb. Oh, and also if they guaranteed that OneWeb would never be used for any kind of military purposes, then they would launch the constellation. This, of course, was completely unacceptable. There's no way to completely control somebody's internet access to make sure that they're never going to use it for military purposes, and the British invested hundreds of millions of pounds in this company. You can't expect them to just disappear. But here, of course, is the conundrum. Arianespace contracted in 2015 to launch 19 Soyuz rockets carrying 648 OneWeb satellites into polar orbit. 13 of those launches have been completed. However, the next rocket that was scheduled to take another 36 satellites up, well, that rocket has now been taken down. Oh, and by the way, Russia is going to keep those satellites and the money that they were paid to launch them in the first place, and they intend to sell the satellites on the open market along with whatever proprietary technology they may have. This would be an act of insanity in most people's world, but in the world of extreme sanctions, it just makes sense. So many extreme actions have been taken against the Russian economy, against powerful Russian individuals, against their private property, that they intend to strike back any way they possibly can. But ironically, this move is also doing a great deal of damage to India, because a great deal of their investment and their technology is involved in these satellites as well. And yet, Russia still expects India to continue doing business with them because they are so dependent on them. Russia is not proving to be very grateful whatsoever to the few countries that are still proving to be at least neutral towards them. But the long-term consequences are, of course, even worse. Arianespace doesn't just not have a rocket that's as inexpensive as Soyuz, they don't have a rocket that can do this job, period. The Vega C, which has come out fairly recently, doesn't have the payload or fairing capacity to carry up the types of satellite collections that have been launched as of late, the packages, that is, that Soyuz has been taking up. and the Ariane 6 has still not flown. It is years behind schedule, and the Ariane 5, the few that remain that is, are already scheduled to take up existing payloads. Arianespace doesn't have a single rocket that's capable of carrying up any OneWeb satellites, or at least not very many of them at a time. And to be blunt, as I usually am, this is short-sightedness and pure incompetence on the part of Arianespace. Since 2014, Europe has known that Putin has been a loose cannon, prone to do just about anything, including invading Ukraine. The invasion of Ukraine should have been a clear possibility to anybody, and since Europe had the obvious intention of trying to dissuade Putin with extreme economic sanctions, they should have started doing something about their lack of appropriate launch vehicles for this extremely vital European company, and yet they didn't do that, not even remotely. Arianespace has been dragging their heels, and the Ariane 6 wouldn't be a very affordable launch vehicle for OneWeb anyway. So OneWeb's options are extremely limited, but in my opinion, instead of turning to the Chinese, instead of turning to SpaceX, they should turn to India, especially considering the fact that OneWeb is a largely Indian-owned company anyway. India, you may ask? I mean, don't they have a very bad track record? Well, it's been getting better, and in my opinion, the best solution for OneWeb in the near future anyway is the GSLV, either the Mark II or the upcoming Mark III. GSLV, by the way, is not a very exciting name for a rocket. GSLV simply stands for Geosynchronous Satellite Launch Vehicle. Yeah, not very exciting at all, like I said. Now, is this a reusable rocket? No. Is this an extremely sophisticated rocket? No. Is this a rocket that has an extremely good launch record? No. However, is this a rocket that could take the OneWeb constellation up in its current configuration for about the same price? Yes, it could. The Mark II could probably carry it out, actually. You wouldn't even need the Mark III, which is a good thing because the Mark III has been in development hell for quite some time. Now, we've all heard about how the Indians have been making inroads into trying to start a human space program, but what is this rocket really all about? What can it do? Well, the answer is not a lot, but about as much as the Soyuz. Now, ultimately, this rocket will be using solid rocket boosters. However, currently it uses up to 4 L-40 liquid rocket boosters, which are powered by what's called a VCAS-2 engine, and it utilizes UDMH as far as its fuel is concerned, with nitrous tetroxide for the oxidizer. It's very, very different from any engines that we use here in the United States. Now, the first stage is powered by a booster called the S-139, and it generates a little over 1 million pounds worth of thrust. Its propellant uses HTPB. Now, it's a solid rocket engine. That's a very strange thing. The first stage actually uses solid rocket boosters, whereas the strap-on boosters are liquid. It's sort of reverse from everything that we do here. Now, the second stage uses a VCAS-4 engine, again with the nitrous tetroxide and UDMH combination, and then the third stage, as you may have noticed, is the first ever Indian-constructed cryogenic stage, and this one bears a lot more resemblance to what we're used to. It uses what's called a CE 7.5 that runs off of liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen. It provides about 17,000 pounds of thrust, but it has a specific impulse of 454 seconds, which is pretty damn good. But the Mark III is going to kind of reverse things. It's going to have a solid rocket booster, two of them actually, and then it's going to take the liquid engines and put them into the core, which is similar to how every other rocket is in the world for the most part. And this rocket has actually had some successful flights as of late. Not very many, but its first experimental flight worked out, and then its developmental flight put a satellite into geosynchronous transfer orbit in 2017, and then it launched GSAT-29 on November 14th, 2018, and then finally sent its second lunar mission, the Chandrayaan-2, into lunar parking orbit on July 22nd, 2019. So even the Mark III version of this rocket looks very promising. Either one would be a good solution for the OneWeb constellation. Not very expensive, and a very decent payload, at least for a rocket of its class. Certainly sufficient to carry up the kinds of satellite packages that Soyuz has been launching up to this point. Now, don't get me wrong, this is a dicey proposition to say the least. The GSLV has not had the greatest track record. The Mark I was terrible. It had only 2 successes out of 6 launches. However, keep in mind, this was from a fledgling space program. The Mark II had 2 failures out of 8 launches, the most significant of which is when the cryogenic upper stage failed, and the Mark III, however, has proved very good. All 4 of its missions have proven successful, including its first developmental launch. The problem is, the first developmental launch was way back in 2014. This rocket has really been consuming a great deal of the Indian Space Agency's revenues and innovation. They need help and they need support to make this work, to make it reliable, and to make their space agency capable of deploying constellations like OneWeb. And guess what? That's exactly what Arianespace should do. They should provide both the financial and the technical and engineering support to make this rocket a successful launch provider for Arianespace and for OneWeb. In my opinion, this is the best solution, unless they simply turn to SpaceX, and there's no guarantee that Elon Musk is going to provide any help for one of his most potent competitors. And here's another very exciting detail that you should keep in mind about the GSLV-3. Its future missions, they are beyond exciting, and if they had support from Arianespace, they would have a much greater chance of success, and the Indian Space Agency would be able to develop at a much quicker pace. In August of 2022, they're going to send out the Chandrayaan-3, which is going to set down a lunar lander and rover, as you may be noticing right now. It's also going to launch a variety of additional satellites out to geosynchronous orbit. Its payload capabilities are substantially higher than its predecessors, and then the most exciting thing about it is a manned mission, and the first uncrewed orbital demonstration of India's crew module launched by this rocket will be taking place in the first quarter of 2023. With the help of Arianespace and with the help of OneWeb, the Indian Space Agency can catapult themselves into the world of manned spaceflight. Oh, and by the way, the Mark III also has a 5-meter fairing, which gives it all kinds of possibilities with newly developing types of technologies, space stations, and even spacecraft like the Dream Chaser. So many alternatives for this new rocket if it has the proper support and funding, which OneWeb can definitely provide. OneWeb is a company that's worth saving anyway. Its competition competition for Starlink, but on top of that, it's providing a tremendous number of jobs, primarily in the UK in the future. That's something that need not be flushed down the tubes because of this awful war. OneWeb should not just be another casualty of all the tragic things that are happening right now. OneWeb can bring a great deal of broadband capability to a variety of different institutions across the planet in the same manner that Starlink can, and there should be no monopoly of these kinds of services. There should be active competition to Starlink, and OneWeb, 2/3 of the constellation is done anyway. And really, I think that the Indian Space Agency and the Mark III of the unexcitingly titled GSLV rocket is the best solution. OneWeb is creating an amazing product capable of providing reliable broadband services to aircraft, for example, as you've been seeing in this video so far. On top of that, it's very responsible. Even disabled satellites are set up with a system to be deorbited by other spacecraft without any complications. They are satellites that are specifically designed to be deorbited by other satellites should that become necessary. So it takes care of a lot of the space junk problems as well. It's an amazing company. It deserves to survive, and it would be wonderful if it could survive and also help a developing space program succeed. If you like what I have to say, if you enjoy this type of content, check out the description. There are many ways to support my channel, or just to like and subscribe, and I will be very happy. So until the world comes together to save OneWeb and all the other companies in the space industry that are negatively impacted by all of the nonsense that's going on right now, I urge all of you to stay angry about space.